Shall we take up Public Works contracting policies? You must be Abby, welcome. Take it away, Abby.
Okay, great. Well, good evening, Mayor and City Council. My name is Abby Fieser. I am the business manager for the Public Works Department. Drew just noticed I didn't spell it correctly, but I didn't have anybody help me spell check my presentation today. But I am going to bring forward a presentation on.
You're not going to live it down.
I know, right? But I had to point it out because you guys would see it eventually. I'm going to bring forward tonight's study session item on Public Works contracting policies. And the reason that I'm bringing this tonight is the City Council had a discussion on June 3rd when the Public Works Department brought forward the grit, rag, and scum hauling contract about some of our contracting policies. So we thought it best to kind of give some background so that we can make sure we got the proper policy direction and we could move forward with that bidding process. So kind of the goal of the study session item is to just do a brief overview of kind of our ordinances and policies that guide what Public Works does around its contracting, and then determine if there's any enhancements that the City Council wants to recommend to help us meet kind of our contracting requirements, our fiduciary responsibility, as well as any improvements that we want to make. Let's see. And then ideally, we can get to the point of how we know we're going to be able to rebid the wastewater treatment plant grit, rag, and scum hauling contract. We'll see how many times I can say that tonight without saying it wrong. So I'll try to keep the presentation brief and then have time for questions when I'm done. So let's move this guy up. So again, just a kind of brief refresher on kind of what guides our purchasing in Public Works as well as the rest of the city is, first of all, we have the city's municipal code. Section 3.1 is our purchasing ordinance. It establishes our general purchasing procedures, and it kind of confirms the City Council's intent that we obtain the best products, services, and construction in the public's interest. So in Public Works, we work to implement this, and we follow through on the bidding process and the competitive procedures that are in that municipal code. At the same time, the city has adopted the purchasing policy, which is kind of a set of guidelines we use to further define how we should be meeting the requirements of the municipal code. The purchasing policy kind of adds some of the ethical issues that city staff might encounter. So it has some things to help us make sure there's no financial conflicts of interest, that we're including transparency and fairness in the competitive bidding process. So that's that set of ordinances that we integrate. In addition, we do have the local minimum wage ordinance that the City Council adopted. We do make sure any contractors are aware of that if it's applicable. And then in addition, we have the prevailing wage ordinance, which basically just demonstrates that the city is required to meet the prevailing wage requirements for any public works projects. And public works projects has a specific definition per the California Labor Code. So we refer to that when we decide which projects should be relevant to prevailing wage. Okay. So just to kind of give you a sense then, with all this ordinance and purchasing policy to put in place, the Public Works Department has created several different kinds of checklists. Here's just an example of one. But we use these checklists to help our program managers kind of figure out what they need to do in order to adhere to the city's contracting policies. We do include as kind of part of this checklist a review of if there's any wages we need to require. So if we think it's applicable, we'll make sure we remind contractors who are bidding that they need to do minimum wage. We will also verify if folks need to be adhering to prevailing wage. So we'll verify if it's a public works project or not during this kind of contract checklist process and before we go out to bid. So if there's anything there, we'll make sure it's in the contract and bid documents. That's kind of that. So more just on kind of public works contracting. I thought it'd be helpful. In 1819, we had about 315 public works contracts. About 56 of those for goods, and then the other 259 were for services. As you can see, about 225 of those were services contracts where prevailing wage was required, meaning they met the definition of a public works project. 34 of those were not subject to the prevailing wage. So we did not require that. Often in those, we said, remember, you've got to do the minimum wage. So about 87% then of all our service contracts are prevailing wage required. Now, let's see. I did want to mention of the 34 that aren't subject to prevailing wage, those are a variety of smaller contracts like technology services, janitorial, pest control, maintenance, and of course, hauling contracts.
I
Yes.
could just, what's the dollar
Amount?
amount?
I didn't actually add the
Just
dollar
number
amounts
of
together.
contracts is all we get. Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I have the spreadsheet, but I didn't add it together.
No worries.
And just, again, of all these contracts, I was going to mention that the hauling contract, the grit, rag, and scum hauling contract, was not subject to prevailing wage, but staff did go ahead and try to find a prevailing wage that was relevant for this contract, because otherwise the requirement would have just been for minimum wage. And in this case, we said, let's make the requirement higher. Let's say at least this prevailing wage. So that was why this particular contract had a prevailing wage when it technically wasn't required. So in general, those are kind of, again, a quick overview of what we do to kind of make sure we're meeting the purchasing policies. And now we've got a couple of options to kind of just review with you if the City Council is interested in enhancing how we do our contracting. So I'll just kind of go step by step of some of the ones in the report. The first one is the living wage ordinance. Again, this is an ordinance that requires that contractors providing services on a city or county's behalf provide the living wage to their workers. In the staff report, I had included the City of San Jose and the County of San Mateo. I hadn't included the County of Santa Clara, but I did add them. They have pretty much the same benchmark as the City of San Jose. And the reason I chose these is because they are kind of the most relevant to our economic area. These are the ones on the peninsula. There are other cities on the East Bay who have a living wage, but the economics didn't seem as comparable, but we can bring those forward if you want. Most of them are lower than the City of San Jose wage. So that's kind of one of the higher ones in the area. This is something that the City Council could look at doing. This would most likely not impact the wastewater treatment plant grit, rag, and scum hauling contract, because that contract, we did put the $22.50 as the prevailing wage, so there's not that much difference in the wage required. What this kind of ordinance would do would be to impact our janitorial contracts and other lower wage contracts, kind of in that 34 number. So I put as the example how much the citywide janitorial contract cost, about $777,000 this year. If we did include a wage requirement similar to the City of San Jose of $22.98, that contract would be over $1 million. It'd be about $300,000 more to the city with the living wage enacted. So in addition, to enact a living wage ordinance like this is very similar to the minimum wage ordinance that the council's already adopted. So you would need to, adopt that ordinance with the new wages. You'd want to educate the contractors about the new wage, and then we'd need to develop some sort of monitoring, since it's our own wage setup, to make sure that that's being used by the contractors. So let me go to the next one. So the second option that we presented to the council was the idea of adjusting or having an adjusted prevailing wage rate. And this is just an excerpt from the particular prevailing wage classification that city staff used in the wastewater treatment plant grit, rag, and scum hauling contract. So this is actually a kind of an excerpt of what they do. And as you can see, the Department of Industrial Relations uses different geographical areas to index the different wage classifications that they provide. In this case, there were 12 counties that were indexed. And so although they include San Francisco, San Mateo, they also include some other counties that have different, most likely different wage rates than we do in our kind of peninsula area. So you could, if you wanted to, come up with some specific prevailing wage rate that was specific for San Mateo. Typically, you'd want to kind of index it similar to how the Department of Industrial Relations do it, and do some sort of survey. And this is where the staff time could get intensive for developing an option like this. We'd want to survey the different providers of a classification. We'd have to also develop kind of what is that classification. So if you just did it for the driver classification for the grit hauling, that's one. But if you decided, hey, there's other ones that may not be benchmarked appropriately, let's do more, that would obviously take more staff time to kind of figure out what the survey rates for those different ones are. So this idea, again, was just to kind of come up with a locally indexed prevailing wage rate. It's difficult to see exactly how it would impact the cost of a contract, because on most of the contracts where we use this classification specifically, it's usually built into an hourly rate or a per haul rate, and so we don't exactly know how the contractor would kind of offset that cost in their bids. So that would be difficult to see until we put it into place and had bids received. So that's why I don't have a dollar for dollar comparison like I did with the janitorial. Okay. And then a third idea that we put out there was the local business, local hire preference. This is another ordinance that you can implement that could provide a preference for local businesses or for hiring locally. I also am using the city of San Jose as an example of this. Different cities have different versions of this, but they had a really nice example in that they're really clear on how they define what a local business is. And in their ordinance, they're also very clear about how this preference is integrated into your procurement process. Because even if you make that preference, you have to say, you know, are you going to rate differently based on this? Or you get extra points based on this? So there's different ways you can go about creating that preference, but in the end, it could potentially help you have more comparable rates to your local area, because ideally you're hiring a company that's local. Local hire preference is much more direct in terms of that, right? You'd be confirming that you were hiring local workers. This one's a little harder to implement though, because right now you can only use local hire preference for local funds. So if you had state or federal funding, you couldn't use a local hire preference for that. And for a lot of public works projects, obviously we have a mix of funding. So the additional costs to contracting here are also difficult to determine, because again, we don't know what kind of competitive field we have locally right now. So we don't know if it would continue to be a strong competitive market. And we also don't know if our current contractors, they may already be paying a pretty good local wage, so especially on some of our other prevailing wage required contracts. The good part of this one is staff costs would be limited. There'd probably be an implementation of an ordinance, and once kind of that was established and the contracting procedures kind of integrated into our processes, you wouldn't have a lot of ongoing monitoring and staff time involved. And then I did put as kind of a fourth option, maintaining the current policies. We do have things in place right now. Again, we kind of require the minimum wage. If there's no other wage that's applicable, remind them that they have that. We have the prevailing wage for a majority of our contracts where they have to meet the State Department of Industrial Relations wage requirements. And then we can also do this prevailing wage for non-public works projects like we did on this hauling contract. This is just, again, we can add an additional wage level to it if there's an applicable wage within the DIR that we can use. So those are what we could, that's another option that we could look at. And so with that, I just kind of put together what we're looking for tonight is direction on if there's any changes that the council would like to see on our contracting policies. And these are 4 options that we put out there. And then additionally, we'll need to make any changes necessary so that we can then go rebid the contract. I don't know if I mentioned, but we have extended the contract with the current bidder, the current contractor who we've had for the last 2 years. So we are currently under contract to have the services completed while we go through the rebidding process. And with that, I'm available for questions.
Okay, questions? Let me go more, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so the county has a living wage, but has there been any discussion about a countywide prevailing wage for San Mateo County?
I haven't heard of any proposals for that. I don't know if anyone else has.
And for San Jose, because I kind of like the idea of a local business, I did look up their program. Did you, by any chance, reach out to them to find out if they've had any issues with getting, I know one of the issues you cited might be vendors, that you might not get as many competitive bids.
I haven't talked to them directly about that.
I think one of the things, and we typically don't compare ourselves against San Jose just because they're so big.
Huge, yeah.
They have a much bigger pool from which to draw for local businesses than we do, given that they're 10 times our size. So I mean, we could talk to them if we could get in touch with someone down there, but it's, they serve in some cases as a service provider to us for the minimum wage. So it's not a great comparison point, and we typically try to stick to comparing ourselves against similarly sized and similarly positioned cities so we can get an apples to apples.
So we don't, I understand, we can't compare ourselves to San Jose and their budget, but there weren't any cities you found that do local business besides San Jose, and who else do we compare to?
I guess what I did was there's been some research on local business preference and how it impacts, and there's different schools of thought in this, but some of that's where I've got most of the data that I had in terms of how it could impact competitiveness, is that there has been some studies of local business ordinances where it has reduced competitiveness. So that was where I brought up that idea, but I haven't reached out to other local cities at this point. That's something we could do if the council wanted to follow up further, but I haven't as yet.
Those are my only two questions, thank you.
This situation that we came into, is it out
Could
of the...
you speak louder, Joe, please?
Yeah, of course. Is this out of the ordinary for us to run into a situation where we put something out for a competitive bid, and the bid that we get has the people doing the work making a lot less money than the people who used to do the work? Does that question make sense? Because that's what it seemed like was happening here, is we had a contractor who was currently paying the people to haul away the grit, rag, and scum to wherever they take those things to. And we had a new bidder come in who was going to pay the drivers a lot less money. Is that fair? Is that what was happening here? I think because of the uniqueness of that situation, it just didn't feel right. I don't know if that's a policy decision. I think in general our policies work quite well, and this was a unique situation that came up for us. But do you see other places where this is going to come up, where in the future we're going to have some outside bidder come in who's going to pay the people doing the work a lot less money?
I think, I don't know. I think fundamentally, we're looking for direction as to, do we need to factor that in when we evaluate what a responsive and responsible bid is, right? Because we put this out to bid and evaluated the two and determined this one was the one. So if there's going to be additional criteria about what we're paying the current, we need to understand that direction, and also we need to get direction as to whether we should insert prevailing wage when it's not required, because that's another thing that we have done on occasion, including in this contract, whether we should continue to do that.
So I don't think I have my facts straight. It was before the current hauler is paying living wage, and we only asked for prevailing wage? What's the factual?
Current hauler is paying $40-something a month?
It's a collectively bargained agreement.
So they're union,
Right.
okay. And then the new bid is prevailing, because that's what we asked.
Right.
Okay, I just want to make sure I have the facts right. For some reason, it's been 3 weeks or whatever.
Yeah, right.
I couldn't remember.
So one
Okay.
other point of clarification is that in terms of the contracts, the quotes we received were based on a per ton amount. So they don't, I think we can infer that they loosely reflect in the labor rates for the drivers, but there are also other costs involved in what it costs to haul a ton of grit, rag, and scum. But the difference is the one Councilmember Bonilla pointed out. Our current contractor is a union shop. It pays its drivers according to a collectively bargained agreement. The low bidder in the most recent round of bidding was not a union shop. However, they did represent that they would pay their drivers a prevailing wage.
And the difference in the bids was?
The difference in the bid is Republic Services, which was the second bidder, came in at 175,235, so 175,235. And S&S Trucking, who was the lowest bidder, came in at $141,700.
700, you say? Okay.
And part of that is also based on where they're hauling to.
Okay.
The Republic is hauling to Ox Mountain, whereas the S&S Trucking is hauling to I believe it's in Morgan Hill is where their facility is. that they-
Ox Mountain is where?
Ox Mountain's
Right over the
Atwood
hill
Bay.
off of 92.
Okay.
Yeah.
Although for prevailing wage purposes, the applicable rate is the job site. So it would always be San Mateo, not, we wouldn't, for example, use a prevailing wage in Modesto if that's where the hauler was taking
Fair enough.
the materials.
Okay, Councilman Rodriguez, you had, I'm sorry.
No, no problem. So when I was reading the report, I was really surprised to see that San Jose was even thrown in the mix because I don't consider them comparable to San Mateo at all. Why were they included?
I included them because of how, I guess, I like how they formulate their ordinance and how they did their living wage. Like, they just had good examples of how to put it together. It wasn't necessarily the rate that we would use, I mean, when it's not necessarily this.
But they're 10 times our size.
But their rate, I think, was based on what they felt was in the local area. I mean, we could look at Hayward. Hayward also created a living wage ordinance. Their rate was about $15.84 is what they were doing for their living wage based on their surveying of their area. So that particular piece of it for, I guess I would say, the living wage ordinance didn't seem as relevant to size, whereas the business preference part is much more related to size.
And as far as you know, no other city other than San Jose on the peninsula has something like this?
Yes, I wasn't aware of anyone else on the peninsula that had it. I have a list here of ones that have it. I mean, Santa Clara County had it, which is why I added it.
Right,
But
there
in
are
general, there
counties.
was no other cities.
I think San Francisco County also has a living wage.
They have theirs. Theirs is very complicated because they have so
Yeah.
many
Right,
different things.
yeah, which is probably why you didn't add
Yeah.
it to the mix. Yeah.
Because they have a lot of different levels of
Right.
things they're requiring.
In terms of so you said there was about a $300,000 difference in the janitorial contract. Were there any other contracts that you think would be?
That would be affected by it.
That
Well,
would be
so that was just our citywide janitorial contract. We did just recently approve a new downtown cleaning contract. And I didn't get the rates from those to do a comparison, but I would assume that that would be another contract that would be affected. In addition, I think our pest control contracts that we typically have, we have a couple different ones for like the sewers that we do in different areas.
So-
Those potentially could be affected.
So what is your best estimate on how much taxpayers' dollars we'd be spending above and beyond what we're spending now if we implemented a policy like this?
That's hard to guess. But I would say if this, it was 300,000 for this 700,000. I would say, well, it's hard to say without looking at the totals. I'd have to get the math out.
Millions of dollars.
Well, I mean, I think in this case it was 300,000 based on the $700,000 contract. I think of the 34 contracts, I should have brought my computer. Of the 34 contracts, I was trying to think what the totals for those, because some of the contracts are professional services and wouldn't be affected, the technology
But we would need to
services.
have that information to make a decision. I mean, that's pretty important information.
Well, and I think those are the kinds of things that if that's the direction you want to go, we can do a little bit more analysis on that. I was trying to lay out the kind of overall approach. I mean, it's going to impact. If that's just one contract at 300,000, it's going to impact.
Okay.
And I can get you done.
Other questions? Rick?
So, I liked your layout of information, and I appreciate the whole presentation. I want to thank Eric for actually suggesting that we look at this as a policy that we probably need to update, or that we need to develop, since I don't think we really had a comprehensive policy that the council was really informed about and able to really work with. So, in looking at the idea, could you put up the list of, oh, there it is. You know, a living wage ordinance, different cities do that, or places, localities do that in much different ways. And I think it's something that the county has already done. And if we wanted to do that, we should look at what the county did and maybe mimic that. I think, and that is something, we already have our minimum wage, which is very close to that. I'm not that eager to get to work on that right now. But regarding the adoption of an ordinance adjusting prevailing rates, I'd like to talk about that for a second, because as I spoke about at the council meeting, we have here a situation where we, like Joe brought up, kind of a big difference between one bid and the other. Our historic bidder, right, who had been winning these as a hauler, who had specialized trucks built, who has a much, they're indicating a much smaller carbon footprint to go just to over the hill and back. Also, I think the idea that they are a local company to me makes a difference, because I think S&S is not domiciled in this county. I'm not sure. One of the things I'm always concerned about when electeds are dealing with policy that's going to create jobs, create opportunities basically for people to go to work, is we need to be cognizant of the fact that we should be presenting opportunities to our people who live and work here first. I really believe that our local residents who live here, pay rent or mortgage, whatever they do, they shop, they are our locals who even vote here, right? They need to be our first consideration. So I would really consider thinking about local business, local hire preference. And I know that's pretty well established. A lot of different jurisdictions do it already. We could probably look at something and devise something that comes from that. And I think that would make a difference in this particular consideration. The other thing I thought about, where in this particular grit, rag, and scum hauling question, was there's not just one collective bargaining agreement for people who are doing, the actual classification is waste hauling. Okay, I noticed prevailing wage that showed up there, and I spoke about this at the meeting, is construction hauling. It's different. The actual classification for those that are collectively bargained and what is actually being done is coming from the wastewater treatment plant. It is waste hauling. And these are very competitively bid collective bargaining agreements. I think we should take a closer look at looking at those already complete agreements and establishing an area standard wage for that kind of work that we could use as a composite or a hybrid, if you will, okay, from looking at those examples that we have here locally, rather than, I think, a kind of a harsh state Department of Industrial Relations wage determination for $22.50 an hour, which really is, for that kind of work in this high cost of living area where we live, just way disproportionate in a bad way. So I don't think anybody driving a truck hauling our waste out of our wastewater treatment plant to any facility should be subjected to that kind of wage. So I'd like to suggest that we look at, in this particular case, since we don't seem to know of any others that are like it, right, that we look at doing something special to level the playing field, because right now what we have is a way unlevel playing field. I mean, anybody looking at this bid and it came in at what, 34,000 less, so I mean that's like 20% lower, right, would think there's something wrong with that bid. And I looked at a lot of bids. I used to carry bids in on construction projects. 20% low is pretty low, okay? And that represents a lessening of standards for people who live here and do that work already, okay? So, I mean, I know those aren't questions, but.
Well, Rick, let me ask you though, isn't that because one is union and one isn't? And there's a huge discrepancy, a big difference between union wages and what those entail and what a prevailing wage would be, right?
Okay, so it's not a union, non-union issue, it's a wage issue, see? And so a union with members who actually do that work every day for the couple of companies who do that work here has negotiated the value of an hour of that worker's work. Where, on the other hand, the non-union employer has always decided of their own volition, how somehow based on something, I don't know where they get it, that this is what we're going to pay.
But I think in this case, when we do prevailing wage, that's what we were going to pay.
They
We
did
decided
say
to
they
do
would
that.
pay that prevailing wage because it's so low, who would argue with it? Okay, and I'm saying it's not, it's misclassification because it's a wage for construction hauling. We have here waste hauling. It's different, and it's an important distinction.
So I just asked staff to comment on the difference. Because I don't really know, when you put together the contract, did you view it as waste or as something else?
Does the state agency recognize it as being different?
Sorry.
He said, does the state agency recognize there being a difference between a construction hauler and a waste hauler? Is that your question?
Yes.
So there isn't a prevailing wage rate for this job, because it's not subject to prevailing wage requirements. So the staff found a job that's as close to it as possible, that is subject to the prevailing wage requirements, and said, this is close to it in terms of what the job is. It's not exactly a job because there isn't, it's not a prevailing wage, it's not a job that by law has to pay prevailing wage.
So the construction one that they found was the one that was the closest to this type of work?
Right.
So they went out to bid with that
That's right.
in mind, okay.
Because they're,
Having no obligation to do that, did it anyway, because the concern was the bids could come back at minimum wage, and that would have been responsive, right, to the proposal.
Mhm.
So it was an effort to address that concern.
And to answer Councilmember Bonilla's question a little bit more directly, we did review how this work would be classified under the labor code, and it is would be, if we were to use prevailing wage, the classification would be, the term is hauling of refuse. That is not the same. That term does not carry the same meaning as trash haulers, which is I think the best description of the contract that that Republic uses. It's analogous to the contract that, for example, the drivers for Recology have. Under the state prevailing wage law and Department of Industrial Relations opinion letters, this particular activity would not be considered that. It is, if anything, hauling of refuse from a construction site. And so that is why we chose that classification. I think there's certainly, it is within the council's discretion to say, no, we don't think it's like that. But that was based upon our review of the case law around this and the Department of Industrial Relations opinion letters that to us felt like the most appropriate interpretation and application of the prevailing wage laws.
Do you have something to say? Go ahead.
Comments? Are you
Yeah.
ready for comments?
Do we have any public comment? Or any more questions?
No more questions.
Questions? Public comment? Seeing none? Okay, go.
So this process gave me pause because of the optics of looking at, oh my goodness, we have people who are currently doing the job and then people who are proposing to do the job for so much less. And I haven't seen that exactly in all the years here, but I appreciate going back to the board and saying, what are our principles? How do we make this decision? What should our policies be? And thank you for doing that. Now, having done that and having reflected on it a little bit more, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about people who work for the city of San Mateo and the city of San Mateo taxpayers and thinking, okay, why would we pay more if that's going to cost taxpayers more? Why would we pay more if that means we're going to have less money to pay city of San Mateo employees? This is a tough place for me to make a policy judgment like this when there are people bidding the contract for competitive amounts of money. I'd never want to see us in a race to the bottom where we're just trying to get people to do things for cheaper and cheaper amounts of money with what is a significant cost here. But the whole time we were sitting here having this conversation, I was thinking about our negotiations with labor groups within the city and how if we adopt certain policies like this, we're going to have less money to provide to our own employees. And that's just the bottom line that I get to. And so I'm not looking to change any policies that would make it harder for us to negotiate with those labor groups, for us to pay the people who work for us less money because we're paying it to outside contractors. Doesn't make sense to me, to our employees, or to our taxpayers. That's the bottom line for me on this contract.
Yep. I'll go next. So I agree with everything Councilmember Goethals just said. My take on this is that I don't think this is a good use of public funds. We have over $100 million pension liability, unfunded. And in the upcoming years, we're going to have to be looking at ways where we can cut expenses and cut higher priorities. I don't think this is the time to be, trying to be the special county or the special city in the county to be voluntarily spending more taxpayers' money on outside of our employees that we don't need to. I think here in San Mateo, we compensate our employees fairly, and that's one of the reasons why we have such a large unfunded pension liability, in my opinion. And I rather any funds that we're going to be voluntarily paying more to go to our employees here in our city.
So I'd like to kind of talk about a couple of things. I think that for me, well, first I'd like to speak that I think our responsibility and our fiduciary responsibility to our citizens is really to get the best value for whatever services we go out and negotiate for. So I think while it would be great to adopt a living wage ordinance, I'm not sure that that's in the best interest of the city at this point in time. I'm comfortable with using the state's prevailing wage rates at this point in time, again, because anything that's going to add more to our staff time, and based on everything I've read in here, we're going to be looking at significant staff time to kind of reinvent the wheel at a time when, as Councilman Rodriguez said, we're looking at a downturn in the economy. We've had discussions already about having, where are we going to make cuts in expenditures? How can we raise revenues? What kind of creative things can we do? So I'm concerned at this point about doing anything that's going to put us in a position where we're going to have to figure out where we're going to get money to do these things, as wonderful as they may be. I would say I do like the idea of a local business preference. I'd like a little bit more information on what others have done, because I did look at San Jose's policy, and they do it either by points or percentage. And it's not a huge amount, so it didn't seem to me that it would be a deterrent to other vendors coming forward, but I think it would be helpful to look at that, because I think keeping business local, if we can, is good for our economy as well as for our citizens and probably our workers. So I like that idea. But at the end of the day, I think really our current model that we have, with that exception, is achieving the goals. And I appreciate the fact that it seems to me staff have done a lot of work to really make sure that when you do these bids, that you're being fair and that you're looking at what's a good wage that meets the needs of the workers as well as our needs as a city, which is to do the best we can. We're not a for-profit, so we can't be in the business of, we don't have the luxury of being able to do everything we might want to do for everybody. We really have to be conscious of that bottom line and be good stewards of our citizens' taxpayer dollars. So that's where I'm at this point in time.
Okay.
Thanks. So, like I said, I'm not really in favor of doing a lot of work to establish a living wage. I think rather than trying to adopt an ordinance adjusting prevailing wages, I don't think that's our business. But I think where we lack an appropriate prevailing wage, we should look at local collectively bargained agreements for the work covered and try to establish a composite wage of our own. We can call it our area standard wage for that covered work. And that avoids putting people who are already doing that work out of work. Okay. The other thing I'm concerned about is how much in the bidding, Republic's $175,000 bid. How much more was that than the last contract that was bid?
I didn't bring that information, sorry.
Was it a significant amount, do you think, or was it in line? I mean, wages haven't really gone up that much over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, my point is, I don't think we're looking for a lot more new money. to pay this contract. Maybe some, but it's
Well,
not,
If I could,
yeah.
so I don't recall the amount of the dollar figure that they put for the current contract they have on an annual basis, but I do recall that last time we bid this, which was like 2 years ago, they were the second bidder as well, but not by a lot. And so we did utilize some of those things, like they were more local. I think it was a different vendor. In this case, when we looked at this, 20% difference in costs, we felt was quite a bit. And the reason we went and found a prevailing wage is because we were trying to avoid, having this discussion again, because it seems like this contract's been up 3 times since I've been with the city, and we've had to have a discussion at the council level each time, which is fine, but we were trying to get to a point where maybe that wasn't necessary. So the reason we chose that prevailing wage that we chose is because it's more conducive than the ecology folks that actually get out of their truck. They push bins around and stuff like that. This is a trailer that's parked at the wastewater treatment plant. The grit, rags, and scum are all dropped into it. They hook up to it, they drive off, and they unload it, right? So that's why we felt that this classification might be more fitting to that. So that's why we brought this forward as the low bidder, and we did some reference checks with them. They work for San Francisco, the SOPUC, and East Bay Mud, and so we did some reference checks as well. We're trying to do the homework that we could do to give you the best recommendation that we could get, and that's why we came forward with this recommendation.
Okay, well, I just have to say, I think, I know you're looking at the composite rate for the thing overall, but it's basically a 50% cut in wages for the work, right? I mean, you agree with that, right?
Well, if you want to compare it to the collective bargaining for wage
Yes.
haulers, yes,
Right.
that would be correct.
Yeah, right. And for somebody to live here, it's not really a suitable wage. I mean, unless you're a teenager living at home, right? So I think this is actually the beginning of a race to the bottom on wages. If we start looking at things this way, where just because we can, we cut the wages in half for some classification of work, I think that's a problem. I have a problem with that. I understand that we represent the public. We have to figure out where to get more money. And that's why I think, if you really look at it, the difference between this year's contract and last year's contract is not labor so much as it is these other things. And I know you're looking at the overall contract amount. Could we find out, could you get us that information, the difference between the last successful bid and these bids that we have?
Kyle's working on it right now.
Yeah, we can get that for you. In fact, we're trying to look it up right now. Kyle is.
Because I think the question of where to get more money is not that big of a question.
I think,
And then I'm still concerned about the carbon footprint, about hauling stuff all the way to Morgan Hill versus just going to Ox Mountain, which is, I think, 8 miles away.
So I do have an answer for historical reference. The last time we had this contract before the council was for 2017. They're 2-year terms. So the last time we did this was 2017. We had 2 bidders. The low bid was Bernardini Enterprises for $141,000, and the second bidder was Allied Waste for $163,000, and we awarded the contract to Allied Waste.
So this contract would be $12,000 more than that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if you want to go back one further, the contract with Allied, we awarded the contract to Allied Waste in 2014 as well, and that was for $154,000. So we're not seeing a huge increase from 2-year period to 2-year period, but as between Allied Waste and the lowest bidder, we are seeing a pretty significant difference.
and I think if I could, I mean, the increase contract over contract is not really the criteria that we use. I mean, based on our own policies, it's going out for bid, it's evaluating the bids that come in, are they responsive, do they meet our needs, and then if they do, looking at the cost component. I mean, we're in an environment right now where we are paying a premium on construction projects, right? 10 years ago, we weren't. But right now, we're paying a premium on construction projects. Everything is more expensive for us. There's going to come a time when that downturn hits where that environment will be more favorable for us, and we will look to get better bids for the work that's being done. So we evaluate the overall value, but our criteria is not, unless we're directed differently, to say, well, it's only a little bit more than the last contract, so it's okay, unless, that's a change in direction.
So, two things. First is,
I gotta wrap it up, so.
okay, first is, if we didn't know the difference in wages, I might totally agree with you, but we do. The wages are half. And as I remember 2 years ago, the discussion was, and we decided to go with Republic because of the local hiring issue and the smaller carbon footprint, which are both still issues. So, with that said, I think I've said all I can say.
Okay. All right, so, yeah, for me, all things being equal, yes, I would more than be happy to go with Allied, but they're not equal enough at this moment in time. And because we have a fiscal responsibility, and I think we're being relatively fair with the prevailing wage, if it was minimum wage, I might have a little more angst. So I appreciate what went into it, and I think the result is there. So that's where we are with it. You got 4 that are kind of in concurrence that the prevailing wage, as was put in this bid, is what the council's comfortable with respect to this type of work.
But I think we all indicated we're interested in the local business, local hire preference. How do you feel on that?
I did not say I was Maureen did. I was a little, I felt because you get money from different places, I don't know how do you tell
expensive
the
to
federal
implement.
government that you're now mandating it, you're getting their money? I'm a little, if you want to look into how that works, go right ahead. But in my mind, it seems very
I
complicated.
was interested in local business. I think the local hire might be more complicated. It didn't seem like local business would be as complicated.
Right,
But-
they didn't have the same
But I would be
restrictions.
interested to
It
see if other cities have done that, what kind of challenges have they encountered? Because I think it's a good thing if we can do it where it doesn't become really time-consuming for staff, but it's an opportunity for us to do something for our local community and economy. So that's where I was coming from, local jobs.
I've seen.
Local business, not
Okay,
necessarily
I'm
hires.
sorry.
That's
Okay.
all right.
I got you.
And just to maybe address that slightly, the competitive bidding is our general rule, and we're not obligated to always, in every circumstance, award to the lowest bidder. Council does have discretion, so, for example, if the lowest bidder in our evaluation process carry with it a bunch of red flags,
It's responsible bidder.
right, we would articulate, that we would recommend awarding to maybe the second lowest bidder, and that has happened on numerous instances. And there could be any number of reasons for making a recommendation that we award to someone other than the lowest bidder. And that is within the council's discretion as the ordinance is currently written.
I see. So you can bring in, if you've got this preference for the local business, you can take that into consideration? I see what you're getting at. Okay. Do you want to look at it or is there consensus to have that looked at further?
Yeah,
No?
I'd like to
No,
see that.
yes, yes?
For me, I'd be interested for the future.
Okay.
What's interesting about it to me is that it wouldn't apply to most of the public works projects
Right,
because
wouldn't.
they're so big and they get state
Small
funding and
amount.
federal funding. So it would be a really small, I think, area where it would even apply. I don't mind us considering it. Like, if we have 2 equal bids, we go with the local one. But I don't know how much staff time I want to spend on that if it's only going to apply in rare instances.
There are established programs already that staff can look at.
Take it into account. So I concur with that assessment. And I actually think that the current policies, I appreciate trying to pay prevailing wages as frequently as you possibly can. I don't think that takes us directly to the bottom. Fiscally, if I had more money, I wouldn't even, be concerned about it. But at this point, I look at those charts you're constantly showing us. I just don't see us as being in that position. So with that, did you have something you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
just want to be clear on the direction. The direction is to maintain current policy, including using staff discretion on on utilizing prevailing wage for non-public works contracts when appropriate.
Yes.
That-
That's for me, I don't know, yeah.
We're coming back or we're not coming? Are we coming back or we're not coming?
Do we need to come back on that sludge, grit, rag, and scum?
Well, I didn't know if we were
The
coming
policy-
back.
Well, this is
on
not
that.
agendized for approval, right?
Are we doing, no, are we doing the local business? Are we coming back? I didn't know if you had consensus on whether.
I don't think there was consensus to look
For
at that.
local
What I heard
business?
is if all things being equal,
We have that
right.
preference.
and one's a San Mateo company and one's not, we go with the San Mateo company.
Yeah.
Is that,
Yes.
Sure.
so,
So is that a modification to our current policy? If it is, I think you have consensus from the council for that. You need anything else? I'm sorry, we've got another one that we have to get to, and I know we've given this a fair amount of time for everyone to be heard. So let's go, if we can, to the next item, which is non-conforming zone code updates. I think you can probably get through this pretty fast. You've got options for us, and we'll talk about those options.
So noted.
But I have confidence in your ability
Just talk really, really fast.
Joe, just to lay it out
Take all the
quickly.
time you need, use as much of the 15 minutes as you can.
Yeah, I brought it up
I like
before,
that.
before the meeting, so.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think did everybody read the staff report, and I think we got the options here.
All right, Ron Munikawa, Chief of Planning. So this particular item is not one that's gotten the same amount of attention as many planning items going before the council. In fact, this is a little-known portion of the zoning code that really affects the people who come in and ask about it. So, non-conforming buildings and uses, we're here to get a general direction from the council. We're not expecting you tonight to say, please amend section 2772010A to say should instead of shall. So it's just to get a general direction
That was
tonight.
going to be my comment.
No. Okay, so we're ahead of the game. So I'm sure the council, particularly given the number of former planning commissioners, what does legal non-conforming mean? It means it was legal when it was built, codes have changed. So again, a small market in a residential zone is one example. It's legal non-conforming, not illegal non-conforming. So if somebody builds a second-story addition to their home and never gets a permit, that is not legal non-conforming, and that is not covered by this section. You'll find most zoning codes along the peninsula, and in fact in California and the nation, address non-conformancies just because things change over time, which was okay before, it's not okay now, and in fact, I think we'll have some examples of was okay, not okay, and now it's something we're trying to encourage. So most do allow for some transition time to amortize or to get rid of the non-conforming use of building. Why is the code amendment needed? Again, this is one of those sections where different people have changed it over different periods of time in response to different circumstances. So frankly, and I've got the city attorney here, we will frequently go and try and figure out exactly what the intent is, because the code sections do this and it's not as clear as, say, what's the setback for a single-family home. It's also not consistent with our general plan policy. So here's the general plan policy. I would note right here, it says, encourage reconstruction and or minor expansion. Right now, it is difficult in the zoning code to allow a minor expansion of a non-conforming use. Really, there aren't real good provisions in the zoning code. So you have a general plan that says one thing, zoning code that says something else. What are some non-conforming buildings? Some buildings are too tall. Some uses or buildings might be too close to residential. So here's a couple of examples. Actually, the first example is more about a non-conforming use. The second is about a non-conforming building. So everyone knows the Taco Bell. This is a non-conforming use. The building meets heights, floor area ratio, but you can see here it's required to be 100 feet from residential. Well, it's right next to residential, and in fact, its parking lot is in a residential zone. So how did this project happen? They had to stay within the existing square footage. There are a lot of limitations that we worked with Taco Bell on. Originally, they wanted to make it bigger. They wanted to have more handicapped accessibility inside the building, but we said as a legal non-conforming use, you can't expand it. So this is one example. Buildings that are too tall or too big, all right, Draper University, Ben Franklin Hotel, obviously, there's an interest in the city to maintain that structure since it's historically significant. This one at 4 West 4th and El Camino Real, it's non-conforming with respect to height. And so we had somebody say, well, can I come in and fill this in? It's not going to make the height any taller than it's already non-conforming. Again, with the non-conforming code, it says you can't increase the intensity, you can't do anything with the building unless you're bringing it into conformance with today's code. So without saying that's a good or a bad idea, that's another issue with the zoning code that we have is, no, you can't fill that in with offices similar to these two because the zoning code does not allow it. So uses that we talked about, as opposed to building uses, the markets and residential zones. We have some TOD areas along Leslie that you might have driven down. Gas stations or convenient markets that are too close to residential zones. So really quick.
The bungalow.
The bungalow, yes. Many of those. So legal non-conforming, it was okay at the time, it was constructed, but then zoning came in and said, commercial has to be over here, residential over here, not mixing any of the foods on the plate. Well, now we are back with TOD and trying to provide these types of services to residential neighborhoods so that people don't have to get in their car and walk. So it's sort of gone full circle, but this is a typical type of commercial use that's non-conforming in a residential zoning district. Along Leslie Street, it's zone TOD. We have a number of non-conforming industrial uses. Should those be amortized, or that is encouraged to go away, or if somebody wants to say, you know what, this parking lot is just not in good shape, I want to pave it, I want to upgrade the building, should that be permitted? Gas stations with convenience markets adjacent to residential zones. Again, here are two examples of convenience markets that are too close to residential, right next to it, but basically you can't do very much of anything with these gas station uses. So if you wanted to locate a convenience market farther away from the residential, can't do that because you cannot change or touch a non-conforming use with very strict limitations. So some range of alternatives. We talked about amortization, that is, we'll give you 5 years and then the use has to be paid off the site. They're very difficult, and there are many jurisdictions, I'm not sure if the city attorney or if the community development director would want to chime in, but a lot of times when it gets close to that date, there's a code amendment that extends that date for another 5 years because it is somewhat difficult, and some councils have found it unpalatable for a successful use to say, sorry, your time is up, you gotta go. The other far range of alternatives is allow non-conforming buildings and uses to be altered and expanded, in effect become permanent in some sort of a permit fashion, whether it's through a special use, like the bungalow market. Okay, come in, process a special use permit, we'll take a look at it, and it's a case-by-case basis. So we sort of went through these. There are some things that the zoning code does allow. For example, if there's one that's a building that's destroyed because of earthquake or fire, we'll allow it to be rebuilt. The reason we did that is, you can imagine there's 10 homeowners in a condo. We only allow 8. An earthquake happens, the building falls down. Well, you can only rebuild 8. Well, what happens to the other 2 people? So there are some.
What happens to what?
So what happens to the other 2 homeowners?
Yeah,
If you
right.
only, so
Yeah.
the zoning code was amended saying, look, if you're legal, you're conforming there, we're going to allow you to rebuild. But really, should there be some allowance for non-conforming buildings to be modified or expanded through circumstances through a special use permit process? Again, we talked about buildings that are non-conforming because they're too tall, the setbacks don't work, and then the uses themselves. If you abandon a use, that's it. That terminates within 6 months. But should the use be desired in a particular zoning district, do you want us to take a look at amending the zoning code of the general plan to allow them to either be permitted or become a special use? So again, that would require a zoning code update. And again, I would go back to that general plan policy that says allow minor expansion of legal non-conforming developments. Now, we're taking a look at the general plan, but one of these 2 things has to change, because right now they're not really consistent.
Ron, could that be minor expansion improvements of?
Well, I think that's one of the things we'd have to determine is
Yeah.
how far is an improvement versus, okay, you're basically doing something completely brand new. Some things for legal non-conforming buildings is, all right, if they voluntarily bring it up to code, do some sort of seismic things, well, you can't, maybe you have to expand the footprint to do that. There's not a provision under today's code. So maybe that's one criteria we use is, to bring it up to code. Yes?
When we're making policy or when you're developing the policy, could we discriminate against the different uses? Like, so for example, if it was like TOD, could we say, you know what, we really want to encourage that to be TOD, so we're not going to let, the
Yeah, I think
warehouse-
that there would be a way, we'd have to make findings, but there is a way to say the TOD, that's part of an adopted land use plan, we studied it. No, we're not kidding here. This is where we want TOD as opposed to another type of, not to call the bungalow, but the bungalow market type of situation we could do where things have just evolved more organically over time. And to get to Councilmember Benia's question, when to allow a quote-unquote minor expansion, maybe it's providing services to the adjacent neighborhood, there's not a history of negative impacts. One question that we'll eventually come to, and the commission can either chime in or we'll come back to you, is whether one non-conforming use can be replaced with another. So if you have a market and there's going to be a small office that provides services to the adjoining neighborhood, should that really be allowed? Because it's not really an expansion or a minor alteration of existing non-conforming use. It's kind of replacing one with another. So that's another question. So here are the questions for the council. Do you endorse this general plan policy? And are there factors or criteria that you want us to consider in allowing a minor expansion? Just so you know, this is the very beginning. We'll have a follow-up study session on alternatives, public outreach, then the usual scenario with code amendments. Again, this is just a repeat of what we had before. And so these are the questions that we're seeking from the council this evening. Again, very general. We're at square one of I don't know how many squares to get to the end of this. And that concludes the staff presentation.
Thank you. Question?
Question, please?
Yeah.
Would this apply to a lot of the multifamily housing that doesn't have any parking?
Well, right now, again, for projects that are residential that have been permitted, if there's an accidental or there's an earthquake or a fire, we allow them to rebuild because it may not be, you think about some of the older 8-unit apartments over parking, you might not be able to fit 8 units and get all the parking on there.
But we have some with no parking at all, right?
No parking at all. We would normally allow that just because we're trying to reduce residential displacement. You're not going to have condos with no parking, but normally, if that's a criteria that the council would like us to explore, we can do that. But really, for non-conforming, it's buildings are too tall or the use just doesn't fit, and that is, commercial and residential zone. But the zoning code presently allows for non-conforming situations to continue with respect to parking because it says only the increased intensity of use. So you think about it, on El Camino Real, you have a lot of restaurants with no parking. Mm-hmm. So restaurant A goes in, we allow restaurant B to go back in without providing any additional parking as long as it's the same. Because there are a lot of areas in San Mateo, if you said, sorry, once that use, if it's a similar use, you go in, you don't have any parking, you've got to bring it up to code, you're going to have a lot of empty storefronts. So parking is a little bit different.
But if you've got a 2-story apartment building and they want to come in and build a 4-story apartment building, they'd have to fully park it?
If you voluntarily decide, I'm getting rid of a non-conforming use or building, then all bets are off. When you come in, it's got to be legally conforming. This is only, and again, we'll have to get to this as part of the whole definition of minor expansion. But if you voluntarily decide you're going to tear a building down or get rid of a use, when you come in, you're going to be subject to all present codes and policies.
Anybody else? Questions?
Great presentation, thank you.
So, no questions. We'll go to public comment. No public comment. We'll bring it back to the council. I'm interested in exploring it. I don't have the exact criteria I want you to explore right now, but go ahead.
So here are my thoughts on this. I kind of see see two perspectives when I'm looking at like an impact, and one is at a local neighborhood level, and then one is a citywide goals level. And if there is a request for a minor improvement, I don't know if I'd go as far as saying expansion, but if an improvement that is shown to not significantly impact the neighborhood and or create a significant neighborhood benefit, then I would be in favor of making that subjective call and allowing that. When it comes to citywide goals, there are certainly going to be citywide goals that we're trying to promote, such as TOD and, producing housing and things like that. So then I would use that same criteria, but at a macro level. Does this hinder our citywide goals, or does it help them? And if it does or not, maybe allow a minor improvement, but minor expansions, I think, is when we get in trouble. That's all I had to say.
I agree with Councilmember Rodriguez. What do you say?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to say that I do actually think we should look at this. But I am in favor of allowing some factors for some sorts of maybe small expansions or improvements, if it's for fire and life safety, if it's for maybe visual improvements. But also, I think we should give the public a big hand in letting us know whether or not this particular use in this area is good for the neighborhood or not. If it's causing a nuisance, we need to look at that carefully. But in general, I'm in favor of, how many of these uses, by the way, do we have throughout the city?
I would say we probably got over 100 if we look at the total. We've
Yeah.
analyzed non-conforming with commercial and residential, but we haven't done the entire city.
Right. So that said, I realize that for safety reasons, some things like gas stations right next to homes are something that if there's a possibility that it could be changed to the conforming use, I think we should try to go for that.
So, I would start with the question that I do support the general plan policy to allow minor expansion of legal non-conforming developments. And I appreciate staff bringing this forward because I think there is great inconsistency between our general plan and zoning, and we need to get that fixed. So I think we need to look at it case by case. And you've outlined some really good factors, like if it's a business that's contributing to the surrounding neighborhood. So I'd like to see more of what kind of specific ideas you would have. And I like the idea of bringing this forward for a public engagement as well, take a look at it. But definitely we need to do something to kind of look at these outliers and figure out how do we bring it into some kind of conformance across the board. So I would not be in favor of ever taking away someone's rights to their property. If they were to sell the building, I could see changing it back to conforming at that point, but not necessarily taking away their non-conforming legal rights. So.
I want to add that I also support the use of the special use permit process to try and improve on some of the uses. I think that's appropriate.
I'm the same way. These two. And I'd even, one non-conforming use perhaps with another one. I would be okay with that if it serves the neighborhood. You know what I mean? So. You got enough to kind of go back? I mean, I think
Sure.
I'm with a minor expansion. I don't think Councilmember Rodriguez is. I don't think you
It all
were.
depends on what it might, what is the difference between an improvement and a minor expansion? I guess there's like a continuum and.
Yeah, and so the way I think we're looking at this is right now we're here. The
Yeah.
next time we come to